Hi, everybody. Welcome to our rendition of the AMAs. Really excited to have you all here. Today, we are talking about the topic of tokenomics, featuring our very own head economist, Alonso. And I will now hand the mic over and have Alonso speak and introduce himself and his background.
Hey, Jen. Great to be here. I'm super excited about this. It's been almost a month since we released our tokenomics materials on the website and everything that we've been doing to design the tokenomics for Sui. And I think this is the first time we have the opportunity to talk about this with the broader community. This is something we will surely do many times in the future. So really excited about sort of hearing everyone's thoughts and addressing all the questions and working together to make sure that tokenomics or Sui make the most sense for everyone. Just in terms of a little bit of background, I feel like I had a little bit of a haphazard route here to Mysten Labs and to designing Sui's tokenomics. My training is in economics and sort of classic or traditional economics. I went to grad school, did a PhD, worked on a bunch of supply chain issues during my PhD thesis, then did a postdoc, was a professor of economics. But at some point, I sort of realized that, what was happening out there in the real world, which is how academic economists talk about what's going on outside of academia, is much more interesting than what was happening in academia. And so I decided to join the very early stages of the Libra project at Facebook, or rather at Calibra, which was the Facebook wallet at that moment, that later got rebranded to Novi. And that's where I worked on the economics team that was designing the Libra stablecoin and the economic incentives around the Libra blockchain and the Libra network. In many ways, that was a great training for what we're doing here at Sui, because although Sui in many ways is different from Libra, there are a lot of parallelisms, pun intended, to how these networks and these tokens and tokenomics work. And so about 6 months ago, I left Facebook to join Mysten Labs. And ever since, I've become very much in love with the project of what we're building at Sui. I think, and the more you read about it, you understand that Sui really has the potential to be a game changer in terms of how blockchain works, and it eventually delivers use cases that can onboard the next billion of users to Web3. And the tokenomics have been very much designed in sync with that engineering design to make sure that from an economic point of view, the Sui blockchain can deliver the same mechanics from an economic point of view as the engineering part of the blockchain.
Awesome. Well, let's dive straight in. So generally speaking, Alonso, what's your view on tokenomics and blockchain?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because in many ways, tokenomics is one of the most important parts of blockchain ecosystems and, how cryptocurrencies work and all these things. But in many ways, it's also one of the parts of blockchain that are least developed, at least in sort of the formal research point of view. Now, so while it's true that if you look at how sort of different blockchains work in their engineering sense and, especially the new sort of layer ones and the new capabilities, in many ways, practice is ahead of theory. But I feel like if you look at the field in distributed systems in many of the fields of engineering and computer science, like there's a lot of formal results that you can sort of base yourself to figure out if what you're doing, what these new networks are providing, makes sense or not. Tokenomics is not there at all. If you look at the formal research in economics, even on very simple issues, or not simple, but things that should be well known by now, like things like proof of work or proof of stake, like the economic results are very behind. And so this is sort of both a good thing and a bad thing for tokenomics. It's good because it means that there's a lot of room to improve the way that tokenomics work along these blockchain ecosystems in terms of doing new innovation, new tricks to solve new problems. To say one example, think about storage, right? With early blockchains, they were so simple in their functioning that storage wasn't even something you could think about, which means that on the tokenomics front, you didn't really have to think about economically how would you create the right incentives to price and address those storage capabilities and what would cost sort of future participants in those networks. In today's blockchain, Sui, for example, we can handle a large amount of on-chain storage, which means that now from a tokenomics perspective, we really need to sit down and think very seriously about how we're going to address that. Because if we leave this issue unaddressed, that could potentially end up creating really bad dynamics on the network in the sense that, people might start storing a lot of data on chain, but not paying for it. But, someone ultimately has to pay for that storage, and that creates a bad network externality that could, in the extreme, end up killing the network. And so tokenomics needs to take this into account. account. That's sort of the good thing, that there's a lot of tricks that we can still think about. There's a lot of innovation to be done to address these new problems. The risky part of it is that because tokenomics as a field of research is so nascent, there's a lot of risk in what we do. Sometimes, if we change 10 things at the same time, we don't really know what their effects are going to be, right? Like a simple analogy is thinking about like a baking recipe. If you're making a cake and you change one ingredient, you can sort of forecast probably what's going to happen with a cake. But if you change 10 ingredients, then you might end up with an amazing cake that is much better than anything you had before, but you might also end up with a disastrous cake. And it's really hard to figure out ex ante what's going to happen. Tokenomics is a little bit like that. Once you start opening up the design space and going across all these other verticals and moving on things like, how do the gas price mechanisms work? How do the proof of stake mechanisms work? How do the storage dynamics work? So on and so forth. The more you start tweaking it, the possibility for creating a richer and more fulfilling ecosystem is very big, but also the risk is higher. So I think, from a high level point of view, I think the people that are designing tokenomics, us included, these are sort of the risk return trade-off that we're making when we're thinking about how do we design a tokenomics framework that makes sense for Sui, but also one that is, to the best of our ability, somewhat stress tested, and we can sort of forecast what it's going to do.
So on that note, what's special about Sui's tokenomics?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I feel like right now, crypto is becoming such a large space that it's hard to keep track of everything that's happening, right? There's like a lot of layer ones that are emerging. They work in very different ways. But what's special about Sui is I think that its tokenomics are built very much in sync with the innovations in its engineering design. And so this basically goes sort of along two main avenues. The first one is Sui, from an engineering perspective, has this key feature that everything that lives on chain is designed as an object. And so that it can be a fungible token, it can be a non-fungible token, but everything lives on the blockchain as an independent object. And basically what that means is that when two separate users are running transactions on Sui that use objects that have nothing to do with each other, they can basically be executed in parallel. And this is sort of somewhat different from what happens in more traditional blockchains where every single transaction needs to be ordered relative to each other, even if the things that they're touching or the sort of activity that they're doing is completely independent. The implication for Sui here is that because of this sort of ability to do this weaker version of ordering, this is something we call causal ordering, in which only things that are somewhat related need to be ordered relative to each other, but things that are completely independent can be executed in parallel. It basically means that at any given point in time, if demand for network activity increases, the chain can essentially scale horizontally. And what that means is basically that each validator can add more computing power to make sure that they can execute these transactions in parallel and have really high TPS, have low latency, and deliver really good user experience. And here's where the tokenomics comes in. If you have a chain that can handle a lot more of activity at a given moment in time, well, you don't want to fall into the pitfalls of more traditional chains in which when network activity increases in the short run, gas fees goes up, right? Because that's really bad for user experience. If I'm an ordinary user in an emerging market and I have a lot of things that I want to do on chain, I don't want to live in a world that when there's a lot of network activity, I'm going to have to pay a lot of gas. That's just bad user experience, and it's bad for my finances and all these kind of things. It's bad for the network. And so Sui's gas price mechanism, and we'll talk a little bit more about it throughout today, is built in a way such that this horizontal scaling, this ability of the chain to scale horizontally and to execute all these transactions at the same moment in time by adding more computing power, also is built with a gas mechanism that ensures that gas fees are still low and predictable whenever this happens. And so that's sort of one of the big innovations of Sui, and it goes sort of hand in hand with this ability of making sure that everything that lives on the Sui blockchain is an object and executing these transactions in parallel. I would say that the other big thing that Sui has and the tokenomics has is that Sui has the ability essentially to handle arbitrary amounts of on-chain data. And so this is useful for people that, for whatever reason may want to have, say, the metadata of their NFT to actually live on-chain, examples like that. And from a tokenomics point of view, the main thing that we've designed is to make sure that anyone should be able to use that on-chain storage. But the only thing that matters here from a tokenomics point of view is that if you're going to use that storage, well, you should pay for it. And that opens up a lot of questions. Like, how do you actually make sure that whenever someone is executing a transaction that's going to store data on-chain, how do you make sure that they pay for it? Second, if they're going to pay for it, are they going to pay for it for a finite amount of time or for an indefinite amount of time? If it's going to be an indefinite amount of time, say forever, how do you make sure that those fees that they're paying up front actually end up lasting in a way that is able to pay for those storage fees forever? And so we'll talk a little bit about it, I think, today, but you'll see that from a high level, the tokenomics have been designed very much in sync with the engineering innovations to deliver a tokenomic system that works very nicely in sync with Sui's infrastructure.
And as a heads up, this is something that we're right now streaming live from NFT NYC. So if there are some issues that people are having with listening through this, please be aware that we are recording this. And at the same time, we will share this recording immediately afterwards with transcripts and blog posts so that you can read at your leisure. And you can also submit questions on both our event chat via Discord as well as through our Mysten Twitter. So please just @reply tag us, and we'll be monitoring throughout the AMA to answer accordingly. And we are taking feedback right now in regards to how the sound is coming through. So we do hear you. We will continue troubleshooting it. It is our first time simulcasting across both Discord and Twitter Spaces. So really appreciate the input that's coming along so far. Well, to continue with the AMAs, okay, so Alonso, there's a lot for us to unpack there. And we know what I'd like to unpack are both of these innovations for our audience that's tuning in. So let's start with the gas mechanism. How does it work and why is it particular to Sui?
Yeah, so that's probably one of the main innovations. I think Sui's gas mechanism, the first time you read about it, it sounds a little bit complex, but it really is designed to create the right incentives to align the interest of all of Sui's participants. So basically, it's created in a way that delivers a really good user experience for Sui's end users, for the operators of the Sui network, basically the validators, and also for the sort of people that have an interest in the long-term success of the Sui network, basically the owners of the Sui token, the native asset of the Sui blockchain. And so essentially when we designed the gas mechanism, our high-level goal was to make sure that we could have a gas mechanism that basically always delivers low and predictable gas fees for end users. I think one of the primordial objectives of Mysten Labs is deliver good user experience across the whole tech stack, and our end users or the end users of Sui is probably what's most important for us. And so how did we do that? How do we create that? Well, first let me talk a little bit about how Sui works. Sui basically divides time across epochs. An epoch is probably going to be about 24 hours. And as the epoch goes through, users submit transactions, validators jointly, as a set, process transactions, and their sort of voting power in terms of how transactions proceed is proportional to the amount of stake they have. At the end of the epoch, stake rewards are deferred as rewards to the validators that participate in this sort of proof of stake mechanism. And since we run a delegated proof of stake mechanism, most of the stake that validators have are actually from individual holders of the Sui token that are not running a validator themselves. And so most of the rewards that the validators make for executing transactions throughout an epoch will be paid out to the Sui token holders that delegated with them in the first place. Now, how does this relate to the way gas fees work? Well, the way Sui works is that in Sui, validators are the ones that set the gas fee for the epoch, or they set what is called a reference gas price. Okay, so basically, essentially, what happens is that collectively, validators sit down at the beginning of an epoch and say, what is the reference gas price going to be for this epoch? That gas price is sort of communicated to all the clients and all the participants in the Sui ecosystem so that, an end user can know what is the reference gas price at this moment in time. If I submit a transaction with this gas price, it will probably be executed at that moment. Okay, so that's how it works. But then that opens up a bunch of questions. First of all, how do we make sure that validators don't just set an extremely high gas price, right? And they sort of, in traditional economics, would be called the monopoly gas price. Well, here's where the gas mechanism is designed to create the right incentives for all participants. Essentially what happens is that the stake reward distribution rule, which means the share of stake rewards that are distributed to validators at the end of the epoch, gets adjusted depending on what each validator submitted as sort of their bid or quote for the reference gas price. And essentially what matters here is that the validators that at the beginning of the epoch said, oh, I want the gas price to be relatively lower to others, are going to get boosted rewards. So this is a way of encouraging validators when they're collectively setting the gas price to set low reference gas prices. And the way they're encouraged is because if they set low reference gas prices relative to each other, at the end of the epoch, they'll be rewarded with more stake rewards. Now, you might be concerned about the other side of this coin, which is, okay, then isn't it just an optimal strategy for validators to, at the beginning of an epoch, say, well, the reference gas price is going to be very, very, very low. That's going to give me a lot of future stake rewards. But then actually, as the epoch progresses, I'm only going to be executing transactions that come in with high gas prices. In other words, validators might submit a very low quote for what the network-wide gas price should be at the beginning of the epoch, but then they won't honor their quotes. They're just gaming the system. And here we have sort of an intricate mechanism which throughout the epoch, basically validators are in charge of evaluating each other. And by evaluating, what we mean is we say, if a validator said, oh, I want the reference gas price to be very low, and they submit a quote at that low level, but then throughout the epoch, they do not execute transactions that come in at those low gas prices, well, then they're doing something wrong, right? They said that then they wouldn't. And so validators are going to be sort of listening for signals and for information about what each other validator is doing. And they're going to aggregate all this information so that at the end of the epoch, they submit a sort of guess or best evaluation about what each other validator is doing. And again, the stake reward distribution rule is adjusted given these evaluations. And essentially what happens is that the stake reward distribution rule takes these two elements. One, it boosts the rewards of the validators that submit low reference gas prices, but it also penalizes validators that don't honor the quotes that they submitted originally. And effectively, what this ends up creating is a gas mechanism that promotes low reference gas price because the validator set as a whole is encouraged to set low reference gas prices, but not too low. Not too low such that the reference gas price is so low that that makes validators have an unprofitable business model, at which point they wouldn't be able to serve those transactions. And so here's sort of a win-win mechanism for everyone. End users win by having low and predictable gas fees throughout the epoch. Validators win because as a whole, they set the gas prices. And so presumably they will only set reference gas prices at which they can operate with a viable business model. But it also encourages to them to operate in a somewhat competitive landscape. And ultimately, the last set of participants, those that own the native asset of the Sui blockchain, the Sui token holders, also win because this promotes the long-term growth of the ecosystem, which is pretty important for the people that have an interest in that network.
So what about the storage fund? How does that work, and why is it suited to Sui?
Right. So this is the other part, right? Like the gas mechanism is sort of what would be related to more of the traditional workings of the Sui blockchain, except that here we've sort of created a mechanism that delivers low and predictable gas fees in a world in which the blockchain is horizontally scalable. The storage fund comes hand in hand with the other part of the Sui blockchain, which is its ability to handle a lot of on-chain data. The economics problem about storage is the following. If I'm a user today that is submitting a transaction and writing a lot of on-chain data, that data in the future has to be stored by someone, right? Like, for example, the validators, the full nodes, whatever. Now, in the future, I've already conducted my transaction. I can basically disappear off the face of the planet, but like validators and full nodes still need to store that data. Now, what's going to happen if I don't pay for that storage today is that those validators are going to have to pass those costs of storage to someone. They'll probably have to pass it on to future users of Sui. And so that creates a negative externality by which if I store a lot of data today and don't pay for it, future users are going to have to pay for my storage. Now, that's terrible for the network because future users don't have the fault that I didn't pay for my storage, and they don't want to overpay because they need to compensate for something I did in the past. So the economics point of view here is, well, how do we solve this externality? The way we solve it is, well, if you store data on chain today, you should pay for it. And this opens up a couple of questions. First of all, should we do something simple in which like, oh, you only pay for storage for a finite amount of time? You say, I want to store this amount of data today, but only for 2 years. And so here are the associated storage fees that go for storing that data. Or should we do something that has a lot better user experience, but is a lot harder to work out from an economic point of view, which is that data should be stored indefinitely, right? And so why is that so challenging? Because indefinitely is a very, very long time. So how do you make sure that those storage fees that I'm paying out today for storage will last potentially forever? And so what we've basically done is we created a storage fund in which the storage fund, what it does is it recollects all the storage fees that people pay when they store data, but the storage fund doesn't actually pay future entities who are storing the data, such as validators or full nodes, with the funds that are in the storage fund, but rather the storage fund is used to adjust the share of stake rewards that are paid to validators relative to the ones that are paid to Sui token holders. And the idea is the following. Because validators have to store this huge amount of upfront data that comes from people that stored data in the past, well, they should be compensated for it. And so whenever the storage fund is very big, which means that there's a lot of on-chain data that needs to be stored, they should get disproportionate amounts of stake rewards to compensate for them. And that's sort of how the storage fund works. And it's economically viable indefinitely because the storage fund never pays out fees out of its principal, but rather is used to adjust the rewards that are coming from the stake rewards, which I should say come from mainly the gas fees and the stake reward subsidies that we will have at the beginning. But that's that's not it. We wanted to make sure that from a storage perspective, we also introduce the right incentives into the workings of Sui. And so what we've enabled also is for users to essentially be able to say, oh, well, whenever storing data on chain doesn't make any more sense for me, I can delete that data and get a rebate. And so essentially what happens is if you store data on chain today, and maybe in 6 months or a year or whenever decide that you no longer want that, you can get not 100%, but a pretty large refund of the storage fees that you paid initially. And the idea is like, those storage fees were always intended to compensate for the entities that are storing the data. If you're not, as a user, you deleted that data, well, those storage fees really shouldn't be there anymore. You can have them back. We think that that's a fair way of thinking about storage for end users. It also creates the right incentives because from economics point of view, it creates the right incentives for you to delete data whenever it makes no longer sense for them to have them on chain. And this is exactly what would happen in sort of the Web 2 world. You might be using Dropbox today and paying an annual fee, but if in 2 years you decide you no longer want to use Dropbox, well, you just, close your account, your data is deleted, but everyone's happy. And so in those ways, it creates the same incentives.
Got it. And, this is the really popular question that we have. What about Sui's token distribution? What will that look like?
So that's obviously a very important question. So I can tell you a few basics. First of all, there will be 10 billion tokens in finite supply. That's going to be the long run amount of Sui tokens that will exist on the Sui blockchain. And, at the beginning, what are the allocations going to look like? In a couple of weeks, we can share the exact percentages. But what I can tell you right now is that the distribution of tokens will replicate what is standard in most protocols. Some of the tokens are set aside for the Mysten Labs team and Sui contributors. Some of the tokens have been set aside for investors. Some of the tokens have been set aside on stake subsidies in the future, stake subsidies for stake rewards, especially during the early phases of Sui where there's a relatively low amount of on-chain activity and gas fees are low and far between. There will be a public sale, and again, we will probably deliver more information of that in a few weeks. But what I want to sort of draw a lot of attention to in terms of the distribution of tokens is that a huge amount of tokens are being set aside for the Sui Foundation. Now, the Sui Foundation is an entity that is independent from Mysten Labs, and this foundation's goal is really to promote the long-term growth and success of the Sui blockchain. And so the Sui Foundation is basically going to take this huge amount of tokens and divide them and use them for projects that support this cause. Now, that means a bunch of things. It could mean from anything from funding hackathons, funding conferences, funding documentation, funding application and developer teams that are building on Sui, helping them create the right type of product that will bring users to Sui and let them benefit, and also promote, a lot of the strengths of Sui, things like interoperability, composability, etc. Another thing that the Sui Foundation will do is really do what we call ecosystem enablement. And I think here the way we think about it is also from an economic point of view is fund the type of projects that are very important for the network in the long run, but that may be a little bit hard to monetize. And that for those reasons, wouldn't be able to have an independent business model. These are the projects that can be everything from like infrastructure projects like wallets or standards type projects like digital identity and things like that that are very important for, say, DeFi protocols or just for the general functioning of the network, and that perhaps might be hard to monetize, but that sort of once they become live, enable a huge amount of additional use cases that other sort of developer teams can take advantage of. And so I think, when we think about the Sui token distribution, I think the most important part for the Sui community is that a huge amount of tokens are set aside for the Sui Foundation, and these really are for the community. Here, the real reason to set aside these tokens is to make sure that they can be distributed in a smart way across the community to create the project that will enable the long-term success of Sui. And I think in a few weeks, we will give out a lot more information on what are the specifics of the token allocation, but also on the specifics of how the Sui Foundation will work, which, as I said, is an independent entity, but the Sui Foundation will start releasing information on how community members and developer teams can start accessing these grants and these tokens to start funding their own projects, and so that you can also start planning on sort of what you're going to build and what your business model is going to look like.
Knowing that's kind of the intention, what will this distribution look like at mainnet?
Yeah, so as I said, most of the tokens will actually be locked at mainnet and will be unlocked over the coming years. The public sale tokens will be liquid immediately. And, as Sui blockchain becomes live, the tokens accruing from stake subsidies as stake rewards for the participants in the delegated proof of stake mechanism will also be liquid. But the foundation tokens, as they're delivered to the team, depending on the exact framework and, conditions transactions in each specific arrangement, those will also probably at least partially be liquid so that, developer teams can actually start funding their projects in a business viable way. And this is sort of one thing that, again, in a few weeks, we'll give a lot more information on.
Perfect. So a user is asking, there are many different blockchains, but in the end, it comes down to EVM. It is hard to differentiate them because they're all forks. Do you have a perspective on the issues here?
Yeah, and I think we have a surprise for everyone today, which is we brought one of our senior engineers and one of the most knowledgeable engineers that we have at Sui on crypto and blockchain related issues, Mohan, on. So I think it's a great moment to bring him and let him introduce himself and start answering questions too.
Hi, this is Mohan. I work on the Sui Tokenomics as engineer alongside with Alonso. I came to the MSC AMP conference and just thought it would be a good idea to drop in. Yeah, I came from the Novi Libra effort in Facebook as well, joined Mysten Labs and believing this is again, using the word paradigm shift in the landscape of L1s. And I have a prediction that in 5 or 3 years, this Sui structure and the architecture probably will be very popular among other different experiments on the L1 space. And we're talking about, I think the question about why everything comes down to EVM. I think the core question to that is there's not really much incentive to actually develop new suitable for blockchain virtual machine execution environment. There was attempts using WAS, what Cosmos and Luna and Solana did to build on top of that. But the problem is when you develop something that is so complicated and so hard to do, like a virtual machine runtime, but there's not really very good monetization or incentive to actually do that. It's only made possible because all the world-class engineers were brought in, like our own Alonso, Sam, and all the experts on runtime machine, developed for 2 or 3 years to come up something like MoveVM. I don't think you can replicate that story again easily, especially in a space right now, crypto, that is so young and propelled by speculation. And that's probably the reason why you see everything comes down to EVM. It's just that there's no reason to not to do that. But I think that's not good for the industry. And I think pouring enough resource and effort to actually break the game and to actually thinking and building from first principle perspective is the maximum value we can bring as in tokenomics. And most people just don't think that much and just reference and use the EVM model. And we're the one who break the glass and really think from first principle activities like what's the value that L1 provided and how to make a sustainable economy out of it and how to provide the right infrastructure and the innovation in terms of how to provide the sustainable growth of the network. And to, for example, I really love the storage fund design. I think that's probably one of the most ingenious one in the current space. And all the problem we talk about with EVM compatible chains, they have this state bloat issues and it's going to come and hit them in the future. But in the case of Sui, having a storage fund gives the user the incentive to free some of the memory that is dead in the block space. When I think as someone who's been in crypto for almost 10 years, when I think about what's stored on Ethereum, it sort of scares me, all the garbage information that accumulated over the past couple of years and continue going that. I don't think that's sustainable. And I think a lot of experts in this field already know that. Yeah, I think enough said, and welcome to any questions.
Great. And Mohan's going to be staying on throughout. So if you have further questions, please continue tagging us on both Discord as well as here on Twitter. And we'll be monitoring as we have potentially more time at the end to take on these open questions. So in terms of the overall landscape, what do you think are Sui's main competitors and how can Sui outperform them?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We get asked this a lot. I think it's useful to take a little bit of a step back and sort of reframe this question. In many ways, Web3 is extremely early. If you ask the ordinary person in the world whether they use crypto, they may say something about Bitcoin or, their investments. But the truth of the matter is the use that Web3 has been promising have not been delivered. And that's both across, financial services, digital commerce, NFTs, decentralized social media, anything you can think about. And so the question there, the way I think about it is, if Web3 makes it, the pie will grow by so much that there's going to be more than enough to go around. And if anything, what's probably going to happen is the future is multi-chain. Some chains may specialize in specific use cases, perhaps even specific demographics. Who knows? There'll probably be really good cross cross-chain communication protocols. And so I think when we think about Sui, I think it's not in our best interest to think, we need to compete with chain X or chain Y or chain Z, but rather we need to think about this of how do we actually onboard those billion next users? How do we create the user experience that it's going to make it as simple for, my mom that doesn't know anything about crypto to do something on chain as it is for her to communicate with her friends on WhatsApp or to send an email on Gmail, right? And so when I think about like Sui's competitors, I think really what we need to sort of zone down into and think about is like, what is our product strategy for like going to market and having people build on Sui. And on that sense, I think we think about optimizing user experience on all fronts. Like we've talked a lot about infrastructure today, about Sui's ability to have really high TPS and low latency. That's great for applications. We haven't talked so much about the Move programming language, but that's something that's very important for Sui because it's really a language that was created to make it very safe for developers to build their products on the Sui blockchain. And it's really created to make sure that developers can focus on what they do best, which is building stuff and delivering new products and new use cases and not having to spend enormous cycles on auditing their code and looking for bugs and that stuff that just distracts and makes it very inefficient. On the product side also, we're making a lot of effort to optimize our user experience from both, the application layer, things like having wallets that are good, and, we'll release more about this information as the coming months go by, but really having wallets that are very slick and smooth and let you interact with the blockchain without having to think too deeply about, how you're going to manage private keys, how you're going to sort of discover other users on the blockchain, how you're going to interact with different applications that are running on the blockchain. This is probably how all blockchains should look at it. We shouldn't really be competing with each other. We should all be thinking about how are we actually going to bring those billion users that know nothing about crypto into Web3 and actually build use cases that are going to serve their purposes, right? Because people, to be fully blunt, in the vast majority of the world, they don't really care about the underlying pipes of the tech that they're using. They just care about having products that work and serve their interest. And I think this is how we should think about it.
And from a product strategy standpoint, how do you plan to expand users and markets?
Yeah, so I think for us in particular, we're trying to address this across various verticals. As I said, we want to work very closely with the community. And so already right now, but also the Sui Foundation as an independent entity will work very closely with developer teams to create all these use cases. In addition to that, we're working with external partners that will be able to either bring their existing Web2 type applications to Sui or to develop independent Web3 native applications. And I think the verticals that we particularly are most interested in pushing right now is on the gaming front, where we think there's a lot of terrain to be covered than has been so far. On the finance front, this includes all both traditional DeFi type stuff. I guess that's a little bit of an oxymoron saying a traditional DeFi, but like what's already exists in DeFi, but also the use cases in DeFi that haven't been successful yet. Things like uncollateralized lending, which are going to be very important for people, say, world that don't have access to not only on-chain assets that they can use as collateral, but just assets in general, right? And so there we need to think about sort of what is the complementary type of infrastructure that we need. Maybe it has something to do with digital identity. Maybe it has to do something with reputation-based systems, so on and so forth. The third and fourth verticals that we're interested in is digital commerce. And that has to do everything with, from payments to peer-to-peer transfers to, letting big merchants distribute coupons on the blockchain and letting users redeem them, ticketing for everything from like concerts. Our fourth vertical, which is everything that has to do with, social media and content creation. And so as, just summarize the four verticals are gaming, finance, digital commerce, and social. We're working both with external partners and developer teams. And our hope really is make success on this promise of really onboarding the next billion users to Web3. And so we're really thinking about the applications, developing the new use cases that are going to serve that purpose.
Got it. So let's talk about the roadmap going forward. How does that look, and when will Sui be launched to the world?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I want to, right now, I'm going to let Mohan say a little bit about the technical stuff related to what's already running, but just to give you a very high level of the roadmap. Right now, the DevNet is already live, so if you haven't tried it out, please do. You can go to sui.io, and all the information is there. Very soon, hopefully, we'll give a precise date soon, but in the few coming weeks, we will probably start releasing the testnet and the incentivized testnet, where the goal really is going to be make sure, how we can harden the protocol and make sure that validators and network operations are operating smoothly. We'll also be testing some of the tokenomics elements during that period. After we've done with the incentivized testnet, we'll go to mainnet, hopefully by the end of this year. And at mainnet, the Sui token will be live. It will be a fully permissionless, fully decentralized blockchain. And you'll be essentially able to do everything you do with other decentralized and permissionless blockchains, except that here you will have all the power of Sui's infrastructure. You'll have the Move programming language, and you'll have hopefully the good user experience that the Sui Tokenomics will give you. So that's sort of a very high level overview on our roadmap. I don't know, Mohan, would you like to say anything from an engineering point of view in terms of how the DevNet, testnet, mainnet progression is going?
Yeah, I think Alonso pretty much already covered most of the stuff. And our goal is first to get the basic stuff running. And definitely for the DevNet, all the staking delegation and the basic structure for the gas incentives has been implemented. And some of our on-chain using written loop, some of off-chain written in our Rust code. And in the incentive DevNet, we'll start testing the structure of some of the value rules, where we try to make sure the gas to produce the stable gas reference price, and people also can actually make sure our gas price is changing around that reference gas price. And in the incentive testnet, we're also planning to get a storage fund up and running, and to the refund of the storage rebate, and to monitor and collect some data on that as well. And in the mainnet, of course, we're going to go with most of the feature we described in the paper, and that's the plan right now.
And in terms of early contributors, we know that they're an important asset to the protocol, but how do you reward them as the protocol grows?
You know, I want to underline one thing, which is Sui is nothing without its community. This is a community project, and early contributors are obviously a key element of that. And so I think a lot of the things that the Sui Foundation is going to do is going to make sure that those early contributors end up getting the incentives that will let them thrive, both in the short term, but also in the long run. The early token allocations that are giving to incentivize these good projects, because of the way, the dynamics of, the Sui tokens finite supply, so on and so forth, the presence of the storage fund that essentially removes tokens from circulation, essentially delivers Sui token holders, hopefully if Sui is successful, with the ability to thrive and benefit from the Sui network's long-term success. So I think being an early contributor to Sui will give those early contributors two things. First, it's just the standard first mover advantage that if you're the first to create a protocol, you learn a lot about both how the protocol works, you learn about how to develop a smart contract on it, you start understanding how Sui users think about things, how to onboard them onto your protocols. And if you're successful, because of these beautiful things that blockchains have, like interoperability and composability, other blocks building on the Sui blockchain can interact with yours. And the other is like these token allocations will hopefully end up being more valuable in the future, given as more activity runs onto the blockchain. I want to do say that, we are all for the community. And so if anyone has any more ideas, and this is probably a good moment to, underline the fact that, we have an active Discord with a bunch of different groups in which we talk about, things related to the engineering, things related to the tokenomics, things related to the incentivized testnet or like the current DevNet, but the future incentivized testnet, et cetera, et cetera. At any moment in time, if you have questions, if you have feedback, if there are things you'd like to see, things that you're seeing that you don't think are right for the way Sui should work, please do let us know. We're there for you. The different members of the team from the engineering side, the economic side, the marketing side, the BD side, we're all here. We really want to make this a successful and thriving community.
That was the majority of the questions that we had received, but we also saw some extra questions coming through. So, one of the key ones we saw was what happens when the big staking firms set their fees to zero to attract delegated stake and smaller validators can't afford to get started.
This thing, this question is like, will Sui actually be a really decentralized and distributed network? I want to sort of state here again that Sui is a delegated proof of stake system. So for the vast majority of validators, most of the tokens that they hold will actually not be owned by them, but will actually be delegated by people who own the Sui token on their own and just want to participate in the delegated proof of stake mechanism. Now, having said that, of course, there is always the risk that some big players end up amassing a large amount of tokens and, in a sense, quote unquote, controlling it now. That's definitely something that would be very detrimental to Sui's long-term success. So what I want to say is, look, the Sui Foundation has, as I said, an enormous amount of tokens that they're going to use to fund projects throughout the lifetime of the Sui blockchain. But at the beginning, most of the tokens will probably not be given out yet because the Sui Foundation is not going to fund all projects on day one. Rather, it's going to distribute these tokens over several years. In the meantime, most of those tokens are going to be used for staking, and that's also good for the Sui Foundation because that means it can get some of the rewards associated with those tokens to increase its pool of tokens to fund even more future projects that are good for the Sui ecosystem. What that means for validators is that the Sui Foundation has, since its interests are aligned with the long run views of decentralization and distributed networks, is that at the beginning, the Sui Foundation will make a big effort to make sure that because the Sui Foundation won't run validators on its own, but will rather delegate its tokens, it will seek to find small validators that are perhaps even owned by the community, but that have, the resources and the expertise to run a good validator, but perhaps are very small and don't have a lot of capital. The Sui Foundation will lend them tokens, so to speak. They will delegate tokens to them so that these small validators can compete with larger rigs that do have that capital. And because it's a delegated proof of stake system, those small validators that are getting a lot of delegated tokens from the Sui Foundation will be able to reap commission out of those stake rewards in order to increase their own capital, fund their business model, and eventually, hopefully, amass enough tokens to be able to function on their own. And so what I want to say is, while these concerns are very fair, there are multiple entities on the Sui blockchain or the Sui ecosystem that exist in order to push decentralization forward and to help community members that are running validators be successful.
Got it. And I think I saw one final question come through. So couldn't the storage fund model be too costly for the use cases of short-term data storage? Let's, take the Dropbox analogy that you had shared. Over there, you pay for a year upfront, then renew if you want to keep storing. If you had to pay for perpetual storage upfront, it really would lock up a lot of capital inefficiently. Is that the case?
I want to say two things. First, for the vast majority of use cases on the Sui blockchain, storage fees will be negligible. So everything that has to do with, for example, peer-to-peer transfers, payments, things that have to do with digital commerce, probably most of the stuff related to financial services, almost everything there will have negligible storage fees. So for the vast majority of people, this is not something they will have to worry about. Now, for things that do require a little bit more of short-term data storage, it is true that in some ways, the model is a little bit more capital heavy than what you would have in a world in which you're just sort of paying for that storage on an ongoing basis. For example, a rent model, right? Like in a rent model, you might say like, oh, you need to pay for storage every year. And whenever you stop paying for that, then the data gets deleted. The reason we went for the storage model is we think it just delivers much better user experience in the sense that it's much better for you to just write a transaction in, pay the storage fees, forget about it. And if you ever want to delete, then you can delete and get the rebates. But the rent model in which you have continuously to start thinking about, okay, I stored this data, paid for the storage fees this year, but maybe next year I need to think about it again because I'm paying on an ongoing basis. For the vast majority of users, this just introduces a friction that makes things much more complicated. And this sort of friction scales as you start having millions or even billions of users that are running transactions every year. It's just much simpler upfront to sort of charge it. Now, you might say, okay, fine, but some users just don't have the capital to do that, right? Like some users might not have the capital if they want to store a lot of on-chain data upfront. They might just not have the amount to pay the perpetual storage fee that they could rebate in the future, but they just don't have that liquidity. I think there what will happen is that you will see some DeFi-esque type protocols prop up that essentially lend you what is needed to pay for that storage. They charge a small premium, and essentially this contract might involve something like the moment that you stop paying that premium, that data gets deleted. So in many ways, even though we have that storage model that charges up front, I think once this financial ecosystem becomes more complete, you'll start seeing other solutions that will somewhat replicate what the rent model, which is more capital efficient, but has worse user experience, prop up for the people that are interested in that.
Got it. I think this wraps up our AMAs for today, but I do also want to highlight that both Alonso, Mohan here on Twitter have been listed up as speakers, so please do follow them. And if you have further questions that pop up, feel free to tag them and reach out. They're quite friendly, they don't bite. And over on the Discord chat, we'll also share out their handles so that you can reach out if you have additional questions on that platform as well. For next week, we will also set on Thursday, we're determining the time with our Move programming engineers to have an AMA around the Move programming language. So once the time is set, likely Monday, we'll start getting that set up as well for people to tune in next week. Thank you so much for your questions and your time, for the audience to tune in, and really appreciate both Alonso and Mohan giving us their time. Tune in next week and we'll have another AMA. Thank you, everybody.